New Explorer Corps, First Arm, Spinward Operations Area, Planet The Last Resort 4, LR Spaceport, November 11th, 3152. Waiting was the roughest part. Once you're in your battle mech, your body reacts as a conditioned response. The adrenaline starts to pump, and you feel the primal need to hunt. Tenica gripped the control sticks of her king crab and took some deep calming breaths as the mech rumbled around her. Within the Eulalia dropship, the mechs could only stand in silent visage as they rapidly approached the planet below. With another strong rumble, she thought about how it must be quite the light show to anyone watching as the 3 dropships from the NEC fleet kicked on their thrusters to slow their descent. Plumes of orange plasma turned to smoke in grays and whites as the ships slowed and almost seemed to hover in the air just above the thick ferrocrete. The starport's landing surface was charred black as it took tremendous punishment. Finally, as if giving up after a long battle with the planet's gravity, the dropship's landing pads hit the ground. Hydraulic shocks flexed, and Tenica could feel the journey was at an end. The rumbling stopped, and now she was left with only the gentle hum of the King Crab's computer systems. Olivia's voice lit up the Lance comlink. She said, "All right, team. Cal has us on the east corner of the spaceport. The Combined forces are going to take the other 3, and we're going to make a show of this. If possible, we want to set up the perimeter in a casual manner, but be ready to punch hard if needed. Keep your eyes open for artillery spotters." The 2 cargo doors slowly opened a few moments later, with bright afternoon sunlight streaming in and illuminating the 3 white and metallic blue battle mechs. "You're clear in 30 seconds, Cal said over the NEC comlink. The locks on the King Crab disconnected, and Tenica took the first steps toward the ramp. Max marched his axeman toward the other ramp, and Olivia was right behind. High up on the King Crab's shoulder, Vasile clung onto his handhold, wearing his freshly painted elemental armor. The King Crab's view screen automatically adjusted for the bright sunlight, and Tenica took in the view of the spaceport. As advertised, it was a modest size. The 3 dropships from the NEC fleet took up almost all of the available space outside of the administration building and passenger terminal. It had been a little suspicious when the Last Resort dropship announced it was headed to an alternate landing location, but now it made more sense. There simply wasn't enough room. Around the spaceport, a shockingly well-developed town sprawled in every direction. Most of the buildings were between 1 and 5 stories and were constructed out of poured ferrocrete that had a red tint to it. Reaching the bottom of the ramp, the King Crab's heavy steps crunched on the charred ferrocrete below. The Combine soldiers and mechs were quickly and orderly exiting their dropships and setting up their standard perimeter. "What do you think, Vasile?" Tenica asked into the Lance comlink. "There are civilians in the windows watching, so an artillery strike is unlikely. We have good lines down the major streets. If this was an ambush, I think they missed their best opportunity already," he responded. Max's voice was calming when he added, "This looks like a place where someone wealthy goes when they don't want to see any poor people." "We've got a message from the Combine link. I'll patch it through," Cal said. The NEC Lance stood motionless in their semicircle around the dropship as the link went live. The voice stated, "Welcome to the Last Resort. We are honored to have such distinguished visitors from the inner sphere. King Ishida invites you to meet with him in his court at your earliest convenience. Please do not hesitate if you have any requests for resupply." "Sounds friendly," Olivia said with a hint of sarcasm. "Trust but verify," Cal said before adding, "It looks like the King's residential complex is outside the city. Vasile, Olivia, and I will be heading in for the meet and greet. Max and Tenica, you're babysitting the dropship. The science team's going to set up shop here at the spaceport and pull data for our mission. Let the Combine deal with the politics. We're just here for science and to keep everybody safe. Got it?" Multiple versions of "yes, sir" were returned on the comlink as the convoy of civilian vehicles began to stream onto the tarmac from the west. They snaked around some of the Oni and Kishi battlesuits before coming to a stop at the base of the Combine Condor dropship. A few of the vehicles headed toward the Leopard and one toward the Eulalia. "Well, looks like my ride's here," Cal said. 20 minutes later, the prisoners from the Condor were packed into the vehicles along with what looked like Captain Sano and some of the other Combine officers. As the vehicles began to drive from the spaceport, they were accompanied by a platoon of battle armor and one of the Panther battle mechs. Captain Sino's Akuma hadn't left the dropship, which left the catapult K-2K and the other Panther along with the Combine armored infantry to defend their dropships. Cal sat in the back of the vehicle, which was clearly designed to impress. The seats were leather and the wood paneling around him must have been pretty expensive when they were new, but it all had the look of a good 40 or 50 years of use. Vasil jogged alongside the vehicle in his battle armor, which Cal figured the Elemental would have preferred anyway to being crammed inside the back of this car. Olivia's Thunderbolt carefully stepped at a less than walking pace to avoid crashing into the light posts and trees which lined the main thoroughfare. As Cal looked out the window, he could see faces from the residents in many windows. He noted that many looked curious but calm. Beyond them, the sun was starting to set in the distance, which painted the sky a pleasant mixture of pinks, oranges, and reds. "So much for the ticker tape parade," he said into the NEC comms. "What is ticker tape?" Vasil asked. "I'm not exactly sure now that you ask," Cal responded. System, the last resort, Zenith Jump Point, Jump Ship, Rabbit's Foot, November 11th, 3152. The data stream is rich. We're pulling everything we can from the sat drones that the Eulalia launched, and the science team should be setting up their station in the next few hours, Corporal Kirsch reported. Rin nodded and put her hand on Miri's shoulder before saying, "Keep up the great work. I want to be able to feed Cal and the others as much data as possible should things go sideways. Right down to the street signs and alleyways. What does that King's compound look like?" Miri pulled up the satellite data and said, "Looks like a variation of the Star League Mott and Bailey base design with high outer walls. Looks like the lower base has the mech bays and storage lining a central courtyard. Within the inner walls are gardens, a large residence, and some additional structures of unknown use. The last resort's dropship's already there, and at a small landing pad just a few kilometers away." Rin frowned as she took in the view of the compound. "It's pretty well designed for periphery production. I bet they repurposed an old Star League fort and made it their own. See the newer-looking poured ferrocrete turrets on the corners? Vasil and Olivia's sensors are mapping the streets as they go. We'll have more on the compound when they get closer. Once they're inside, we'll know more about it than the residents do," Miri said with a smug smile. Planet, the last resort for King's Compound, November 11th, 3152. Vasil looked left and right as he passed through the open gates of the King's compound. The vehicles continued their crawl forward, turning back on themselves just outside the inner gates, while the battlemechs and armor set up in a standard defensive ring within a ring around them. Olivia took her spot in the gap created by the Combined forces and waited. Vasil could see on his HUD that the last resort mechs were in their mech bays along with a smattering of tracked armored vehicles and militia units either milling around or catching the show as the new battle mechs and battle armor arrived. As he stood by Cal's vehicle, he noticed one confused-looking militia member pointing at the clan battle armor and talking to a peer. The vehicle doors opened as a dozen last resort militia walked up, and the prisoners from the raid were pulled out and roughly shoved towards a domed cylinder building that looked like a barracks. Several of the younger children in the group were crying and had to be carried or consoled by the other kids or the women. All were prodded in the direction of the building except for the scruffier older Mechwarrior who was separated and marched toward the inner gates, which were now opening. Cal stepped out of his vehicle and stood next to Vasil. He looked like a small child in comparison to the elemental. "Are you ready to work on your diplomacy?" Cal asked. "Not something Jade Falcons are known for, unfortunately," Vasil replied before adding, "If you want me to kill a bunch of these militia, on the other hand..." Let's make that plan B," Cal chuckled. Just then, a woman wearing orange fatigues walked up to Cal and Vasil. In her hands, she was holding a tablet computer, and the whole look made Cal think of one of those classic galactic cruise directors from the commercials that were all the rage in the Republic before the fall. "If your friend there wishes to enter the King's home, we ask that you leave the battle armor behind. The facilities simply cannot accommodate its size," she said as she looked up at Cal. Looking to his left, Cal saw roughly half of the Combine battle-armored soldiers climbing out of their machines after moving them to the center of the defensive ring. "I think you should stay out here, big guy," Cal said as he turned to look up at Vasil. Vasil turned and returned the gaze before saying, "But Captain Rin said..." I'll be fine. I've got a dozen Combine soldiers and a noble Captain Sano's retinue to keep me safe. I'll yelp on the comlink if I need you. Olivia, are you all eyes and ears? Cal said, patting the elemental's forearm. Aff, Vasil responded. Vasil turned and walked over to Olivia's Thunderbolt as Cal joined the Combine officers on their walk through the inner gates. I do not like this, Vasil said in a direct comlink to Olivia. Olivia's Thunderbolt leaned forward a bit as if the mech itself was going to respond to the statement. Over the link she said, You and me both. We're being strung out. What can we do? Vasil asked. It's the Combine's show, and they seem quite capable. If things get hairy, be ready to bug out, Olivia said as she checked her sensors for the 100th time since walking into the compound. The mechs inside the Last Resort's mech bays registered as powered down, but they were still closer than Olivia would prefer. It would have been nice to have Max's axeman there. The thought of him cleaving through Higgins' mortis with an axe briefly put a smile on her face. Walking through the inner compound, Cal made note of the mixture of well-manicured gardening and the militarized defensive positions they concealed. The packed gravel pathway leading up to the manor house was sloped, and every few dozen meters there was a telltale sign of a pillbox opening. Anyone who tried to make their way up here would be in an extended kill zone. Thankfully, the guns were silent and the whole retinue reached the manor house without issue. The building they entered looked like a bizarre mix of styles copied from photographs of old Terra. It seemed to be several structures built at different times by different people, all mashed together into something that would make a proper architect weep. The inside looked to be more of the same, with objects and furniture that looked antique, mixed with brutalist steel panels and aluminum frames. After walking through a long hallway, they entered a grand hall where soldiers in orange fatigues stood along the walls. Across the room were fabric-draped tables lined with dozens of types of food and drink, along with lit candles. At the head of the hall was a much smaller banquet table, also covered in red fabric. Sitting in the middle position was a rather plain-looking elderly man of mixed Asian ancestry wearing robes of frayed red silk. Next to him sat Gia, who had that grin that made her look like a predator who was about to pounce on an unsuspecting prey animal. To avoid shuddering, Cal had to look away quickly as the whole procession made their way in. Cal stepped to the side and let Captain Sano and his retinue take the lead. Guards held up their hands, and they all stopped just 5 yards away from the head table. There were a few seconds of awkward silence before Cal was pushed to the side by the guards leading the captured Mechwarrior closer. He was roughly pushed to his knees, still wearing the clothes and the cooling vest he had when he was taken weeks ago. "Welcome back to the Last Resort, Lucius," the king said as he leaned forward slightly. Lucius chuckled at the statement. His tired and unkempt features showed a deep sadness, but his response was unexpectedly jovial. He opened his mouth and sighed before saying, "I know you missed me, brother, but an emissary would have been much more welcome than an army." It was pretty obvious to Cal at this point that this Lucius guy wasn't a pirate, though none of the Combine officers seemed shocked by the revelation. "We couldn't have your crimes against the state go unpunished. Justice seeks you, Lucius," the king said before he drank from a goblet. Lucius shook his head and replied, "What you don't know about justice could fill this hall. You murdered your way into that chair, and you murdered my family and friends." The king rolled his eyes and waved his hand dismissively before saying, "Spewing lies in front of our distinguished guests? How crude and undignified. Guards, can you please escort my dear brother to his new accommodations and make sure he is comfortable?" Cal wanted to step forward and say something, or to do something, but he was a single person in a room full of people who simply seemed not to care about how fishy this all sounded. It made his stomach turn, but he remained motionless as the guards dragged away the Mechwarrior. "I'm so sorry about that, but it's best to get the messy issues out of the way first," the king smiled. Captain Sano took one step forward and stated, "I am Captain Yosh Sano of the 43rd Galadon Regulars. We appreciate your hospitality and willingness to meet with us tonight. I have brought my team to help facilitate the agreement for transfer of technology as agreed upon with Guider Flores." Yes, of course. My dear Gia, please escort these officers to the lab complex and make sure they're taken care of," Gia stood and walked around the table. Cal watched her sway her hips in that leather uniform and fought his urge to roll his eyes. She passed through the assembled Combine group, and 4 of them followed her out of the hall. This left Cal, Captain Sano, and a dozen Combine soldiers without their battle armor standing in front of the jovial king. "Now the business is being done. Let's eat! It's a very important tradition here that we feast after a successful transaction. Please take a seat and tell me all about how the glorious Draconis Combine is doing. We don't get much in the way of timely news out here," the king said as he gestured toward the seats along the 2 rows of tables in front of him. Cal grabbed a seat along with the right side, opposite from Captain Sano and his remaining officers. At this point, he was increasingly suspicious and planned not to eat anything. As if on some unheard command, the hall doors opened and well-dressed people began to come in and take the remaining seats around the tables. They sat and introduced themselves as Sir or Madam from so-and-so from some prefecture that Cal immediately forgot as soon as they said it. He just nodded along and sat politely as the room filled with conversation and the sounds of a well-produced dinner. Cal watched what the locals ate, and then saw the king stand up and move around the room, sampling from various platters as if making a point of showing off that they were safe. The act was overproduced, and it made Cal even more suspicious. Not wanting to appear rude, he took a few items that looked like meat pastries and even took a bite, but carefully spit it back into a napkin. The Combine soldiers began to eat, and Captain Sano even began to sip from a glass that one of the locals kept refilling. "From where do you come? Your uniform is different than the others," came a voice that brought Cal back to the here and now. "What? Oh, sorry, I'm not part of the DCMS, I'm with the New Explorer Corps," Cal responded to the woman sitting in front of him. She looked like she was at least 10 years older than seemed possible for someone sitting upright, though clearly an effort was made with what had to be an industrial-grade sprayer to conceal her age with makeup. "And what do you explore? I think we're already discovered here," she said as if she was suddenly winning a verbal sparring match. Cal looked around the room again, trying to find something that would explain why he was so tense and why everything felt wrong. The old woman bristled at his lack of response and took a long drink from her wine glass before turning to speak to the Combine soldier to Cal's left. By now the king had returned to his seat at the head table and was scanning the room with a smile. Cal watched him closely, trying to find some tell that would help him avoid what felt like impending doom. Instead of some grand gesture or suddenly calling in guards, the king seemed to be getting tired, first leaning forward and resting his chin on his hand, then yawning and adding his other hand, both elbows on the table. His eyes began to droop and then close entirely. That's when Cal noticed the conversations were starting to die out. He looked around his own table and saw several people from both the locals and the Combine soldiers slumping either forward to the table or back as if they were looking at the ceiling in awe. As each second passed, more and more people seemed to fall asleep. Looking down at his plate, with a single bite missing from his food, Cal reacted quickly and slumped as if he was among the rapidly sleepy crowd. He slid to the side, out of his chair and onto the floor, where he pulled himself underneath the table. Though the fabric covering the tables offered partial cover, Cal figured it might offer enough time for him to figure out a way through this. Cal tapped his comlink and whispered the agreed-upon code word, "Sideways." Olivia opened her feed with a Combine and yelled, "It's a trap!" as Vasil launched into a sprint toward the inner compound and fired his jump jets. End Part 9. Thank you as always for joining us on this adventure. Sorry about leaving you on a little bit of a cliffhanger there. I really appreciate it. Hitting the like and subscribe button tells YouTube that it's content worth sharing with others. If you want to go above and beyond, channel memberships are great and the money goes right back into the channel and helps to keep the spigot of nonsense open. Big thanks to those who have already taken that extra step. Until we meet again, take care and go make the world a slightly better place today and tomorrow.